Thank you, everyone. We appreciate the opportunity to be here to talk about the nuclear option. Is micronuclear an option for Alaska? Got four great panelists here. Before we start, I'll just have some introductory remarks. And we're going to take a lot of questions from the audience, so please take a picture of this, the code 273-6807. Post your comment or your questions on Slido, and we'll get to them during this panel session. I want to start with, all right, that's okay. We had some slides. Doesn't look like they're loaded up there, but we'll do just fine without them. So I want to start just by setting the stage before we get to meet our distinguished speakers, just to say a little bit about nuclear energy in general. So you're aware, nuclear energy in the United States produces about 20% of the electricity. Of that, nuclear energy is 50% of the zero carbon emissions energy. And what we see are customer commitments to decarbonization, policies that are encouraging decarbonization, and so the industry is developing a set of advanced reactor technologies to meet a diverse set of market and customer needs. Microreactors are a key piece of that advanced reactor technology portfolio, an exciting piece in my opinion, because it's going to bring nuclear energy to places that never before could have utilized this reliable, resilient, affordable, and clean source of electricity. So what are microreactors? Generally, they're 1 to 10 megawatts in size, though they could be larger or smaller. And they're essentially like-for-like replacements for diesel generators. So anywhere you have a diesel generator, think about you could swap this out very easily for a microreactor. Due to their small size, they can be developed and deployed very quickly. In fact, one of the first microreactors is on track to begin operations end of 24, maybe early 25. In fact, if you look at all of the market demand for microreactors, there are over 10 planned to be in operations by 2030 in the US and Canada. So today I'm joined by a distinguished panel of experts from the leading companies developing microreactor technologies. So let's get to hear about their companies and their technologies. Mark Cheeseman, I'm going to start with you. You joined Rolls-Royce in 1998, where you held a number of senior engineering technical project roles in support of the Royal Navy's nuclear propulsion program in the UK. More recently, Mark has been leading the development of new products and markets where this nuclear expertise can be applied with a focus on microreactor technology for defense, space, and commercial applications. Mark, please tell us about Rolls-Royce and your technology.
Thanks for that introduction, Marcus, and Governor Dunleavy and all the audience here. It's great to be here in Alaska. So Rolls-Royce Group, for those of you that are not familiar, is a global power systems and propulsion company. Operates in several markets, probably most famously in the civil aerospace market, where the large turbofans that we make are installed on many of the wide-body fleet. We also have a large power systems business, mainly based out of Germany in Europe. 150,000 engines out there that we look after, mainly reciprocating engines and diesels. We have a defense business spread across two main sites, both the UK and here in the US, in Indianapolis, and different areas within that business. Again, the aerospace theme comes through in large transport as well as combat air. What we also have within that business based in the UK is our submarines business, as Marcus mentioned, where we, since the early 60s, have designed, manufactured, delivered, and looked after the naval reactor plant that provides propulsion and energy for the Royal Navy submarines. So there's always a reactor out there operating somewhere that we look after. Recognizing that many of the products within that portfolio need to transition. We've heard about the energy transition an awful lot already in the last day and a half, and Rolls-Royce is, we think, well placed to play a major part in transferring some of these products into a new era. Our Rolls-Royce electrical business is one of those areas where we focused on the electrification of flight. You may have seen in the press the Spirit of Innovation, which broke the world record for the fastest all-electric aircraft, 387 miles an hour. So really looking at the innovation that's going to drive the change for us. Equally, our small modular reactor business, which is going through some of the design reviews in the UK and elsewhere around the world to bring clean power. And that's a venture that has spun out of our heritage and expertise in the submarines business. Our next step along that journey then is to look at where else can we use that capability. And we think microreactors for both civil and defence applications, and perhaps it will be defence that goes first, it often does in nuclear, is an exciting way to take that energy transition forward.
Thanks, Mark. Next, Christian, we'll turn to you. Christian Rabidi is currently focused on developing ultra-safe nuclear corporations' U.S. market and framing the micro-modular reactor technology in the context of integrated energy systems. Previous to joining USNC, Dr. Rabidi worked at Idaho National Laboratory, where he explored how nuclear energy could be used to achieve a decarbonized and affordable U.S. energy system. Christian, welcome. Could you tell us about UltraSafe and your technology?
Well, thank you, Mark. So I would say that UltraSafe, first of all, is technically speaking still a startup. I would say pretty large one. We are more than 350 people now. And the reason why I mentioned this is because technically speaking, we are a startup, but we started in 2011. And the reason of being that year meaningful is the company was founded right out of Fukushima. And the company was founded actually with the purpose to be sure that the technology that was developed in the last 30, 40 years was actually put at use to avoid that situation like Fukushima will never happen again. And that led to the creation of our commercial product, which is the micromodular reactor. The micromodular reactor is a small-sized reactor that is actually designed specifically for this type of remote application mining like we can find in the context of Alaska. Right now, we are, I would say, developing, deploying two of these micromodular reactor. One is in Chalk River in Canada. One is at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. They will be operational in 2027. So we are pretty close reality in terms of deployment. USNC, MMR, and Alaska. Well, when I joined the company about 2 years ago, I started coming up here in Alaska, and we found an incredible background in the sense that we have started to talk to the people. We have found a lot of curiosity, desire to understand if this technology is the right one for Alaska. And since, when we started 2 years ago, things have been evolved in a very positive way. So right now we are talking with a lot of the communities and a lot of the utility that may be interested in deploying this technology. So actually I'm very happy to be here today, and looking forward to have this discussion and keep coming here in Alaska, which I like a lot. And I'm sure that the micromodular reactor will have a place in the energy ecosystem for Alaska. Thank you.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Christian. Next, we'll turn, Josh, to you. Josh Parker is the Director of Business Development for BWXT Advanced Technologies. He's responsible for strategy development, sales growth, business expansion, and identifying and building strategic partnerships and alliances for the advanced reactor technologies under development, such as Project Pele, space nuclear power and propulsion, and commercial terrestrial reactors. Josh, please tell us about BWXT and your technology.
Sure, yeah. BWXT, it's a company that's been around for well over 150 years. Not a lot of people know us. We take the mantra of our customer, key customer, a lot, where we run silent and run deep. So for 65 years, we've supplied the U.S. Navy with the reactors for the submarines and the aircraft carriers that protect our nation's waters. In that capacity, we built over 400 reactors. In our history, we build 2 or 3 a year to supply that. We also supply research reactor fuel to 5 of the high-performance research reactors here in the United States. We played a key role in the nuclear history of the country. In 2018, we have a visionary CEO. He kind of said, let's take that history and try to broaden that into how we can apply nuclear technology into spaces, both for terrestrial uses as well as space nuclear applications, and use the capabilities of BWXT and the nation, so to speak, to grow the application there, where we've safely done it for over all these years. So we're working in multiple projects. Mark mentioned Project Pele. It's a small micro reactor. It fits in a 20-foot Connex box. Does 1 to 5 megawatts electric. It's a high-temperature gas reactor that uses TRISO fuel. I think all of us up here are TRISO fans. We'll probably talk a little bit about that and the safety significance behind that fuel form. That's a small reactor. It's got a very specific purpose for the U.S. military. We use that technology. We expanded it to a much larger reactor, still in that micro size, though, Mark, I think it falls a little bit outside your 10 megawatt category there. We're 50 megawatts thermal, 17 to 20 megawatts electric, depending on the power conversion side, and we'll get into a little bit of how industrial use cases versus just pure electricity generation might change how that reactor operates and what the end use case is. So we leverage that. We also are in space nuclear, which is an up-and-coming field, really interested in power on the moon, ways to get us to Mars and explore the solar system faster than we do today. So glad to be here, and once again, Mark, thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you. We'll go to our fourth speaker now, Michael Valore. Michael is currently the Senior Director of Advanced Reactor Commercialization at Westinghouse, responsible for leading the effort to bring the eVinci to commercial market. He's previously held roles leading procurement and projects for AP1000 in the US and China. Welcome, Michael. Please tell us about Westinghouse and your technology.
Sure, thanks, Mark. So really excited to be here again in Alaska. Actually, I'll start with, really became passionate about the potential for nuclear for Alaska my first trip up here, which has been maybe 3 years ago now, where as the governor and other speakers have talked about, the mere existence of some communities in Alaska are threatened by the cost of electricity. So, those types of messages really resonated. So we've been developing a microreactor called the eVinci microreactor. It's 5 megawatt electric. It's really designed for the markets in Alaska. It's very easily transported. We bring it with fuel. We take it away with fuel, solving some of the spent fuel challenges. But a little bit about Westinghouse. We have the most nuclear reactors on the power side, the commercial power side in the world. So of the over 400 nuclear reactors producing power and electricity in the world, over half of them are Westinghouse technology. And then the most recent nuclear reactor to be commissioned and put onto the grid in the United States just was put online around a month ago in Georgia, and that's the Vogtle 3 plant. The Vogtle 4 plant will be coming online shortly after that. So we will have over 2,000 more megawatts of clean electricity on the grid as a result of Westinghouse technology in the United States. We're also working on some other advanced reactor concepts, such as a 300 megawatt SMR, as well as a non-nuclear technology, which we're very excited about for a couple specific applications in Alaska, which is pumped thermal energy storage. But again, really great to be here, and I think it'd be, let's have a lot of time for questions and get right to the panel. Thanks, Mark.
Yeah, great. Thank you. And again, we'll definitely get to your questions. Remember, it's Slido. It's number 273-6807. We're going to talk a little bit, explore some detailed topics, and before we get to the Slido questions. So, panelists and audience, when we talk to potential customers, other stakeholders about nuclear energy, we typically get 5 questions, usually in this order. When are they going to be ready? How much are they going to cost? What about the risks in construction and licensing? Are they safe? And what about the waste? And so let's dive into some of those topics here. So we're going to start with the technology and get to know that a little bit better. Mark, I'll turn to you and ask you, what can you tell us about the innovations and the technologies that are going into microreactors? How is that benefiting safety and power delivery?
Thanks, Mark. And if I may, I'll start with safety and then link it to technology, because I think nuclear is a long-term game. And there isn't a day goes by, I'm sure, in any of our companies where safety isn't absolutely number one in our minds. And well, how does that manifest itself? Well, in almost in all aspects of what we do, right from research and technology, where you're looking for knowledge gaps, things you've learned from in-service reactors, how can you fill those gaps and make things better? Through design, where there's deep analysis in terms of how things operate, to come through the design process that's there to make sure that we all progress in the right way. Connected then into manufacture, and that's probably the hardest step of all in this, is turning what you hope to be a good design into something that you can make and make a reality. And through that manufacturing process, making sure the quality is at the right level and that you have the right protection. And then into in-service and learning all the time, continuously being curious about how things are working and feeding that right back into the process. And I think on top of that sort of internally facing piece, there's then the independence part. And nuclear leads the way in terms of engaging regulation, bringing third parties into the equation, seeking out the best information that's out there to make sure our products are as good as they can be. And I think that culture that runs right throughout is massively important. When it comes to the technology then, and perhaps what's different around the reactors that are out there today and the ones that we're looking to bring to market as various industries represented here, I think you have to start with the fuel. It was mentioned earlier, TRISO as one manifestation of accident-tolerant fuel, coated particle fuel particularly, not only supports safety, but also the way in which you can deploy and use these reactors in different settings than what we're perhaps used to. So for those that aren't familiar, coated particle fuel uses a kernel of uranium oxide, coated with various layers, including pyrolytic carbon and silicon carbide, to give you very high temperature resistance. You can operate this fuel very, very high, which makes it efficient, but also means your risks are minimized, and structurally very, very sound, so very difficult to break those particles apart. The size of the particles, you're talking a poppy seed for each one, then brought together usually in some sort of monolithic core, again, bringing protection. And so that change in fuel form, which is an innovation that was made many years ago, but as I said, manufacturing it is quite often the really big challenge, has now come into a point of maturity where it can be made at scale, and then the task is to drive the cost down of that manufacture. So starting with the fuel, you get a different sort of safety concept. Whereas many of the reactors that we know today in power production are based on light water reactors, pressurized water reactors, where you need water as your coolant, you need to keep your core full and topped up with water all the time. And of course, as you work through the accident scenarios and the fault scenarios that might come, you then need redundancy in the system. So you need distributed parts, extra systems, things to kick in if a fault does occur and you need to recover from it. By looking at the fuel in this way, with this format, then you try and, if you like, cope with some of those major issues that could come around right at source for the fuel itself, protecting those fission products and making it a more palatable option to deploy. So fuel is probably the single biggest step forward between previous generation reactors, in my view, and the ones that are coming online and will come online in the next few years. Beyond that, where is the other technologies you need in order to make a full reactor system? So you need some way to move the heat away from the core. You need a way to transfer that then and put it into a power conversion system to generate your electricity. And I think there's lots of innovation that can be driven through how you do that. Heat pipes are one of the ways that you can take heat from the core. There's also high temperature gas reactors that use the gas, helium, carbon dioxide, various different formats in order to move the heat away from the core and into your power conversion unit. I think there's then in our ability to transfer that heat, so in how you take the heat from those systems and move it on, there's lots of innovation that can be driven out through there. But most of those systems are reasonably well understood in terms of how they work. It's really around how you optimize them. In terms of power conversion itself, I think the most likely route for many of the applications will be a Brayton cycle, which is a gas turbine as we know and love it, but replacing a combustor in the middle by using that nuclear heat to provide the energy to the compressed air and then pushing it through the turbine. That turbine then driving the shaft, which in turn drives your compressor, and also your generator to generate electricity. I think individually each of those technologies are reasonably well understood. And it's the integration of those, the optimization of them, it's understanding the individual customer requirements and what's needed for different applications, and then perhaps the control systems and then the remote monitoring. Because I think with a deployable reactor, that ability to monitor multiple products out there in service and gain the data from them is going to be hugely important in making sure we understand and we learn and we continue to learn.
Yeah, great, thanks. And I'll add to that. So one thing that most people don't know is the nuclear industry is one of the safest industries in the entire world. And so the technologies you talk about in terms of enhancing safety just go to make that even better. And sort of pivoting from safety, which I'm sure we'll come back to, but pivoting now toward cost and economics, one of the interesting things about advanced nuclear technologies is that the same technologies that are making them safer are also making them more competitive. So Christian, I'll turn to you and ask, what can you tell us about cost competitiveness versus value that microreactors bring, and then also anything you want to add about policies that are supporting microreactors?
So I think, first of all, we are all private companies, right? So I think that, the first rule in the free market is, you will not try to sell a product that is not competitive, because just, you're investing, a lot of money and you know that you're not going to sell one, right? So these microreactors, actually, they were designed for this market. So we began looking to these markets like remote application mining, and then we designed the product. It was not designed, it was, the product was not designed before identifying the market. So in this respect, we are completely aware of the challenges that they come from a low-density population, remote villages, and we actually designed a product that was cost competitive with the current technology that is used to generate electricity. That is essentially the point. It's really is not that we are looking for a situation where the high price of electricity allows us to come in. It's just the product was designed for this market. We had the challenges that we had to overcome. For example, our technology does not need a cooling system because in this region it's difficult to find water for the cooling. So again, the technology was made for the market. Thus, we are here because we believe that we will be cost competitive. Now, as you would expect, there is always a challenge in deploying new technology. It's not like you have a new great idea and the first time you do it, you achieve the cost competitiveness that you would like to see. Keep in mind that especially for this type of reactor, we expect cost reduction coming from the developing of the supply chain for building many of those. So as you pointed out, that challenge needs to be addressed. And right now, from a political point of view, and it's gone? Oh, no. From the political point of view, in terms of support to the deployment of this new technology, we have a lot. We have the Inflation Reduction Act, and of course, everybody can decide to look to the Inflation Reduction Act in different, from different angles. But if you look, for example, to the investment tax credit, that's a huge incentive for technology like nuclear that's capital intensive. Probably a week ago, we also saw that from the USDA, a new initiative just came out, the new era, that could actually help the deployment of nuclear reactors for some of the co-ops and the utilities. So again, there is, the product is right for the market, was designed for the market. There could be an initial challenge in terms of cost deriving from the first of a kind cost, but the political support that there is right now is actually what we need to overcome that initial challenge. And I also want to conclude about, recalling the fact last year the microreactor bill was passed here in Alaska, streamlining the licensing process. So I think really we have kind of a perfect storm.
Yeah, thanks, Christian. So moving into that, we talked about the great innovations and the cost competitiveness and value of microreactor. Josh, I want to turn to you and help us understand, how can microreactors be used? What applications can they be used for?
Sure. Christian already touched on it a little bit, but you know, if you go back to Project Pele for what the Department of Defense is doing there with the reactor in a Connex box, they're looking to fix the supply chain tail. If you look at having to get diesel into locations around the world to support our military where there's a large number of casualties just protecting that supply chain to get there, the cost also becomes prohibitive, and then you have nice, reliable power that you can do in those locations. It's very similar to what we see in the remote areas. Kristen kind of mentioned it. The microreactors were purpose designed for remote applications where you have supply chain tails of getting either natural gas, diesel, or other energy sources to a location. Like we have in Alaska, we hear that a lot when we're up here talking to people. It fixes that, and you can provide energy to a location in a remote place. The other thing that it can provide is a decarbonization technique for industrial processes. Christian mentioned mining. There's mining, some processing that can be done on the mine. A lot of our reactors, I think actually all of our reactors, not only produce electricity, we also produce high temperature process heat, which when you're looking at you know, petrochemical operations, mining operations, they not only need electricity to operate their equipment, they also need heat. So you get a 1-2 punch there with a nuclear reactor that you can take advantage of and drop it in here in the market. You can lead to a decarbonized product, which when you get it out into the market, you can sell for a premium, as we're beginning to hear from industry that if they can label it as a carbon-free product, they're willing to pay more for it. Therefore, they're willing to look at their energy costs and look at this. The other thing is when you're susceptible to energy prices, natural gas fluctuations, coal, or other things, nuclear provides a stable base. So nuclear is very capital intensive on the front part. All of our reactors are manufactured in a factory and deployed on site. We're not a major civil project like Vogtle is. It's a nuclear project, but I mean, there's so much concrete in that plant, it's a major civil one. Microreactor, we build it in a factory and we deliver it with minimal site impact. And then what it's going to do is it's going to operate for, most of us are in the years category here for a core. And it gives you a levelized cost of electricity that's predictable for an end user, both a community or an industrial end user out there. And that predictability is key for them to make a business case for this, as well as the fact that a nuclear reactor operates with a high capacity factor, which means it's always on. Day, night, winds blowing, not blowing, the reactor's always there. And when you think about industrial processes and where they need heat and electricity, a lot of times if they shut down, in a couple of hours, their plant begins to sustain damage, their processes begin to freeze up, things begin to, you know, plate out in pipes, vessels. So having the consistency and the reliability of nuclear power there behind them through an emergency or an upset condition in their plant that keeps them going is key. So you provide resiliency and redundancy as well with this uses. So we have both electricity in remote communities as well as industrial processes, both within the northern part of this world as well as even inside the lower 48, where there's several interests as well for this.
Yeah, excellent. Yeah, and I know we've engaged with many mining companies and oil companies that are interested in this technology. Next, so hearing about all this, innovation is not just in the technology, it's also in the business models. And so, Mike, I'd like to ask you, what can you tell us about novel business models that are being considered for microreactors, and what about used fuel?
Yeah, so from a business model perspective, I think we would all agree up here that the microreactors will offer a much wider potential from a business model perspective than the large reactors that exist in the United States today. So first on those, typically vendor supplies reactor, constructor builds reactor, someone else owns the reactor, operates it, and holds the license, and then provides power, which is typically nuclear utilities in the United States. There are some plants in the US that have different financial owners than the utilities and things like that, but that's the typical model that has multiple players involved. I think that model will certainly be viable for microreactors. But I think, you know, as Josh stated, right, there's a much more direct reactor to user interface with this type of technology. So I think that will enable, just from a pure common sense standpoint, models where you have fewer entities really involved. And I think this will evolve over time. So I think early reactors will likely follow that more traditional model, where you have a nuclear utility involved, and you have a vendor, and the utility is probably the owner and the operator and the licensee, perhaps. But then I think that'll quickly evolve into a situation where you could potentially have a commercial company even be a owner-operator licensee in the future. And some of those, those models lead to direct power purchase agreements, energy as a service almost, providing BTUs to an industrial process. Because again, you have a reactor that's very tied to a specific area or a specific industry, which isn't really the case right now. We're just putting electricity onto the big lower 48 grid. So I think in the future it's going to be a wide open ball game of different business models. It might take a little bit of time to get there, especially with the regulatory perspective. But those models are also greatly supported not just by the use cases, but by the simplicity of these reactors. You don't have a unit with 300 or 400 person, O&M that you have to manage from an operations maintenance perspective. We're really all talking, like single individuals, or just a few individuals really, being required to operate these, and maybe in the future actually none. So I do think in the future these get to more like a diesel generator type of deployment, as we discussed, is really what these technologies could really shine for. In Alaska, especially in the earlier days. On the fuel side, so we'll just talk a little bit. Spent fuel, really big topic. Continues to be a topic in the United States, but I think it's helpful to start with some facts there. So the entire amount of nuclear spent fuel generated in the United States operating fleet, which, as Mark mentioned, provides over 20% of the electricity in the United States and has now for about 50 to 60 years. That spent fuel, if you just stack the assemblies next to each other, would fit on a football field. So when you consider that's actually a very low volume of fuel. That fuel is currently being stored at operating sites throughout the United States. And someone else, I can't take credit for this, but they stated our industry is the only industry where we know where every atom of our waste actually is. And it's been extremely well controlled at these operating sites. Now, I think for microreactors, that's likely going to be a different model. That's one of the reasons why a lot of us are going with a more transportable style design, because we didn't feel that communities in Alaska would want to have interim storage of spent fuel. But it is a challenge, but I would say it's mostly a political one. When you pull back, kind of the political side of the argument and you look at the facts, commercial nuclear spent fuel is being stored extremely safely, has an excellent track record. There's a low volume of it, and it's being done, all over the United States right now. Hopefully we get to a long-term repository, with the federal government and find a location. But there also are now some private companies, of which Westinghouse will likely, enter this market as well in the future. It's really looking at and licensing spent fuel storage locations in the U.S. And the last thing I'll say on this, because I know it's a big topic, but I think it's important. Honestly, even in Canada and the United States, the communities around the proposed spent fuel storage site locations are actually quite positive on their installation. It's a huge economic benefit. It can be done in rather remote places. I'm not pitching this for Alaska, but just general statements. But it really then turns into a political football that's hard to overcome. So again, I think from a pure facts and science perspective, the spent fuel stories, it's actually a very good one. And me having worked in a large supercritical fossil plant where we filled a reservoir full of coal ash, that coal ash will be there forever, and that was a single plant. So there are trade-offs with waste, but nuclear is excellent at safely storing it.
Yeah, that's a great point. And just to wrap up the used fuel conversation, before I talked about waste, but you talked about it as used fuel, and that's because used fuel only uses 5% of the total energy that's in there. And while they can be recycled, and certainly they're not being done that way today, someday in the future, this could actually be an asset and a resource. And then tying up the safety of used fuel storage, they're safe enough. You can go out there and hug those dry storage casks, and you would be completely safe. Now, we do recognize there's still a political obstacle to overcome and a lot of debate on whether it should go to Yucca Mountain, a consent-based storage siting. The great thing is the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has said we can store this stuff safely for hundreds of years, so we have the time to get the decision right. And we see from other countries like Finland and others, they've overcome the political challenge and are actually constructing a repository. So with that, I'm going to move into the audience questions because we've gotten a large number of them. So I'll just skip the prepared questions and get into it. And I'll start with this one. It was the first thing that I brought up, which is the timeline. And so the question is, tell us about the timeline from the point at which a customer decides they want to proceed with a microreactor to how long it'll take before they can actually generate electricity or heat. So what can you tell us about that timeline for a project?
Yeah, so I'll say the first ones will be longer. It's from even a state perspective, rules around regulating these are still being determined as there's a bill under comment right now in Alaska in the legislature, just for instance, that, there's a lot throughout the U.S. First time regulatory always takes a bit longer. So, I think we're all looking at, 27, 28 type deployment timeframes for first ones in the U.S. So, and, most of us are talking with those first customers or have, initial contracts in place. So, I'd say that's a relative time frame, but as we get past those first ones, that will shorten and could shorten very significantly as really the pacing item now for nuclear is, again, typically the construction, which we're greatly eliminating here. So as we get into the groove of licensing sites in a repeatable fashion, I think it could be, 1 to 2 years, maybe even less than 1 year as we get into the 2030s.
Yeah, I think I confirm the timeline is the same. Generally, we expect 28 to be, deployment commercial. I think construction for these microreactors is going to be very quick, right? We are planning to build these microreactors mainly in factories, right? Licensing, well, that is not really, depending on us. Definitely we would like to see that become as short as possible. Siting analysis and things like that. But in the future, I believe that it will take some time to build trust in the technology so that we can speed up this process.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so let's turn to that. Another question we have is on the licensing process. So the Nuclear Regulatory Commission is the federal agency responsible and given authority for regulating safety for nuclear power. And so the question is, how is that? Is that a seamless process? Is there a lot of risk or time in the licensing process with the NRC?
I think Mike kind of hit it on the head. Is the NRC is getting ready for this just like we are. So they're learning. So with Project Pele, it's actually not an NRC license. It's actually a DOE authorization basis, which means the DOE is going to license the reactor, which we talked about timeline. We started that in 2020 for design, and it's going to go into Idaho National Lab and go into operation in 2025. So fairly quickly there in terms around. But what the NRC is doing is they're actually shadowing the DOE and watching this authorization basis and learning what's going on with Project Pele and how the DOE is going to authorize that reactor and taking those lessons learned back into themselves so that when we actually come with a commercial reactor variant, they're sitting there ready going, I've seen this before, I'm ready to go. Now that doesn't mean we still won't have a lot of first of a kind. We're going to learn, they're going to learn. Like Mike said, it's going to go back and forth, and it'll take a little bit longer. But once you kind of get over that first initial learning curve on both sides, the licensing process is going to start rolling much more smoothly. We see that in the light water reactor industry today, that licenses move very quick as we move through the commercial fleet. So.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that the NRC is doing, they have what's called a generic environmental impact statement for advanced reactors, which addresses 80% of the environmental review. And so they get that out of the way. And so what's required for each specific project is a very small amount to help that more efficient licensing. In addition to just that, what other things does the NRC have to do to really adapt their process for these new technologies? Somebody mentioned perhaps these won't even have operators on site, remote operations. You know, what types of things are we working with on the NRC to enable these new technologies?
Yeah, so from Westinghouse perspective, we've been involved very deeply in what's called a pre-application process. So we've sent now about 30 of our key technical areas with test data, analysis data, you know, also explaining to the regulator how we intend to continue to develop the technology and license it. And so we've gotten, you know, had a really robust dialogue with the NRC. So a lot of it is, you know, just in helping the regulator understand the technology and the intention and how much detail and rigor is being put behind it to prove that it's safe in advance, such that when you're really going into that full application type process, they're really not surprised. So this is what the NRC's recommended, and Westinghouse, we're executing on that now. And yeah, I think the regulator is often viewed as this unreasonable entity, but I think they're people just like all of us, and they're required to assure that designs are safe for the public. So they take that seriously, and I think they've done that job actually very well in the United States, quite frankly. So we're working with the regulator on a day-to-day basis, and really it's just, as Josh said, right, it's a back and forth to help each other learn and move the process forward.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just comment from a UK and Europe point of view rather than NRC, the Office of Nuclear Regulation in the UK. I think it's fair to say the US has led in this particular technology. The ONR is much more familiar with sort of larger, what we call small modular reactors in more the 200, 300, 400, 500 megawatt region, rather than down to these very small deployable reactors. So we'll be watching very closely how that conversation progresses with the NRC. And as Mike said, it's all about no surprises culture. How do you bring all parts of this system and that safety system that involves all of us, how do we progress that together, making sure we respect and understand the needs of each aspect of that, from design through to public perception, through to what's going to be deemed to be safe. Mm-hmm. And we do that as a joint team.
Yeah, absolutely. Let's turn for a second to the supply chain. And the question here, can Alaska develop a microreactor supply chain, or do we have to go with vendors outside the state? What's Alaska's opportunity in the supply chain for microreactors?
I'll jump on that. So in regards to supply chain, there's actually a couple of vendors actually up in the state that has supported at least BWXT supply chain in the past. I don't know about some of the others here, but you already participate in some ways in a nuclear supply chain. With microreactor deployment inside the state, there is opportunity to grow. As we've been up here, and Mike's mentioned that we've been up here a couple of times, different times as well, learning about Alaska, the capabilities of Alaska. There is potential there. Even beyond just supplying components, if you think about this, while we say it's not a civil project, there is still site work, there is still construction on the ground, some infrastructure that needs to be laid to actually deploy a reactor, and those would be looked to for Alaskan companies. We wouldn't want to port that in. You have the local knowledge of the conditions there, of how to build here and how to construct. So the supply chain there is open. I think it's going to take the entire U.S. to get the supply chain up and running. You know, we've let well over $40 million of procurement for Project Pele and getting parts in. And in many places, there's only one supplier at the moment for a certain component. So we're seeing that the supply chain is there, it exists, and in some cases it's weak. So there's potential to grow because the broader supply chain, the multiple reactor vendors, the multiple designs, and the chance to deploy these are going to require more than one. So a great investment for Alaska to look at in growing the potential of what we need and willing to talk to them about it.
I would like to reiterate on the concept. You know, Alaska has a lot of experience in oil and gas, very large project, right? So there is a lot of engineering, a lot of construction, and these are actually resources that can be sourced locally. So there is a lot for Alaska company to do in the development of the microreactors, yes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think just to add, I think there's something around skills as well. And while I think it's important that we as vendors look to make these products as self-sufficient as possible, if Alaska was to adopt nuclear in a wider way, then look into the educational establishments, those people that can train the next generation, the people that can be familiar, converting the people that already understand energy from an oil and gas sense, and helping them to understand that next step to nuclear as a different way to provide energy. And I think that strategy, and that's part of where policy comes in, is going to be important to underpin this if it's a long-term reality.
Yep. Let me turn to another question. So we haven't talked about Indigenous and Alaska community engagement, and one of the most popular questions here. So what is being done, and can you explain what's being done to engage Indigenous Alaskan communities, and what more do we need to do to bring them along? So the question specifically here says to ensure that those communities have prior and informed consent. And certainly it's not our intent to force microreactors on any community that doesn't want it, but how can we engage them, or what are we doing already?
Yeah, so I think one of the things we're doing is having these types of discussions, right? Around the Eielson pre-bid meeting, actually some of us were all there. We did a town hall discussion jointly. I know, a lot of us are doing also separate discussions like this, but one of the key parts, I think, is explaining the facts of nuclear. There's a lot of, excitement about it. There's a lot of kind of questions about it, but, I think it's having discussions like these and really getting, starting at the surface, but starting to dive deeper and just what is this technology? What, how safe has it been throughout the decades? Very. And where are these new technologies going? So I think at that kind of higher level, even with the state or the government up here getting involved as a neutral broker, I think those things are helpful. We've seen some success with that in Canada, especially where the federal government played a pretty strong role in just really helping to explain what is nuclear. And then prior to projects, I think we'd all advocate that you don't have projects until you really have those engagements and you get that support. And then on the regulatory side as well, I think it's important to note the regulatory process is actually quite public. So even throughout the regulatory process, there is a large amount of opportunity for community and stakeholders to really have input into that process and very deeply understand it. So this is something I think that we've, hopefully we've begun moving the ball even a few years ago. But even then, the whole way up to and prior any reactor would operate, the community has a large amount of opportunity to participate and understand. And the process is built out that way purposely.
So, Mark, I would like to mention that when I started coming up here, I was always coming with Mary. It's actually our director for stakeholder engagement. She's here. And we are really trying to be out as much as possible. And really what I think is about letting know there is a channel, an open channel. I've been in several town hall meetings, but really I think that letting everybody know that there is a way that we can be reached out. We will be actually more than happy to answer to questions and try and explain the technology, right? So.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's an area where the state of Alaska, the government, and the universities can help sort of be that broker intermediary to help connect the communities to the industry and foster that dialogue as well. Want to move to the next question on can we give more details on the cost of electricity production of microreactors and how they compare to diesel generators? And just so I don't put any of the companies on the spot, because that's probably proprietary information, I'll talk about a report that the Nuclear Energy Institute did, and you can go on Google to find it. Just Google NEI microreactor costs, and you'll find it. But in that report, we analyzed the potential cost of microreactors and compared them against diesel generators and only against the cost of diesel fuel. So we didn't look at capital or O&M. And what we found is that the cost of the microreactors, if I remember correctly, was about 15 cents kilowatt hour up to maybe 40 cents kilowatt hour. We mapped that over the cost of diesel generators in current markets. We had rural Alaska, rail belt Alaska. We had even islands and defense installations. And we found that under almost all scenarios, microreactors were cheaper than the incumbent. Even the very first microreactor, which is always more expensive, but once you come down the learning curve, certainly can be cost competitive. And so I'll just encourage you to go look for that report to address that one. Next question is that a lot of these advanced reactor concepts, not just microreactors, are planned to come online by 2030. They're all going to need fuel, uranium-based fuel. Some of them will use fuel like we have today, enriched up to 5%. Some will use enrichments up to 20%. So can you talk about how we're going to assure access to fuel, especially recognizing that Russia was about 30% of the market and they're no longer accessible? So how are we going to get fuel?
Yeah, I mean, of course, this is depending on each company, right? I can speak more closer to my company. So here, we entered with a supply agreement for some of our initial reactor already. So, you know, the availability of the fuel, the LU plus, or, you know, it's actually already in the market is possible. So I think that, of course, everybody is appreciative and look forward, you know, the availability of the HALU and the DOE efforts in this direction, and definitely that will make you know, economics even better, and even delivering even a better product. But nonetheless, we are already starting to build our supply chain for the fuel with, you know, Urenco and so on.
Yeah, I think step back even further, right? Russia is a large supplier of uranium, but there's actually quite a bit of uranium throughout the Western world. You know, Canada has very large supplies. U.S. actually does as well, especially in the Western U.S., Australia. So there's quite a bit of uranium production capability out there. You know, but it was very much a commodity that Russia was a big player in that market. They're now becoming, you know, really ineligible to supply into this market. So supply production will be ramped up throughout the Western world from a pure uranium commodity perspective. And that's been happening since February 24th of last year. Westinghouse even playing some role in that. We make a huge amount of the nuclear fuel for operating plants throughout the world today. But on the HALU side, the U.S. government, the federal government, supporting a program called the HALU Availability Program. We actually expect RFPs to come out to support that effort in the very near future. It's around $700 million worth of funding. And what I'll also say is this is not something that's foreign to the United States. It's just that that technology and really the need to have it in the United States somewhat atrophied. But it's really not something where the fuel supply chain is starting from you know, a blank piece of paper. It's really reinvigorating processes and equipment and components and vendors that really have had that capability, and the country has had it before. We just need to get it going again.
We like to throw a lot of acronyms around, so I want to be clear. Like light water reactors, the big commercial fleet, they use uranium enriched to 5 weight %, uranium-235. Most of our reactors are enriched above that. Most of them use something we often refer to as high assay low enriched uranium, or HALU. Hence we throw names around all the time. 20 weight %, uranium-235, and that more energy, more gas in the tank, if you will. Also enables us to get that size down that we need. It's a chicken or egg thing, and it's a public-private partnership. Mike mentioned it, the government's involved, they've already allocated, RFPs are coming out. Christian's company, through supply agreements, are coming from the private angle back to the industry to signal the demand. It's going to take all of that coming together to make this a reality. And then there's going to have to be a capital investment in a plant to actually build centrifuges to enrich the material. A lot of people like to make this an issue, but I look at it and I think we look at it and say it's starting to be solved, and I think it'll be solved. It'll still support the reactor deployment timelines that we've all been envisioning and talking about up here today.
Yeah, I mean, it's very much needs that government support, that long-term strategy to justify that investment in infrastructure and in the capabilities you need. Technically, it's all there and doable, and there's enough material in the world to make it happen. It just needs a strategic positioning that says this is something we need to do, and it will happen at the scale that's required to justify that initial investment. So I think government-led, but highly informed by industry, customer bases, and all those users around the world that need it.
Yep. Thanks. So here's a great question. So is Alaska ready for microreactors? And I know that last year there was the legislation that helped enable the private sector to move on microreactors. Alaska's developing regulations around these. What else is needed for Alaska to be ready? And then second part of that question is, where does nuclear fit in Alaska's future energy portfolio when they have wind and solar and geothermal and all these other technologies? Where does nuclear fit?
Essentially, right? So let me start from the second one, where nuclear fits with variable renewable solar and wind and so on. Well, I will start saying something that I don't know. My mic seems to go. So first of all, you don't have sun over the night, so you will need batteries, right? Batteries are expensive. So is there something better than batteries? Maybe nuclear is an option. So actually, before joining USNC, my job was actually studying the integration of nuclear with solar, wind, battery, and so on. And every time we did this analysis, it turned out that if you have nuclear in the system to ensure the base load, to do, to jump in when we don't have wind or solar, the overall system cost goes down. So that is definitely a plus. Again, it's not just me. It's really, there is a lot of studies out there that show that the nuclear is capable to overall improve the performance of the system. Now, with respect, is it Alaska ready? Well, first of all, we just discussed about the timeline. The timeline is 2028, so there is definitely some time before we will have to deploy this reactor. I think that maybe is my wishful thinking is that having a workforce ready for operating this reactor and providing the workforce, for the microreactors in the remote application, that will be great. There is time, but definitely it will be a very nice effort to work on.
I think it echoes the governor's strategy of all of the above. It plays a role with all the other energy sources. There's not a magic bullet here that one technology is going to get us through what we need to get carbon-free in the world. Is Alaska ready? I think the end use cases are there. I mean, there's remote communities, there's logistics tails to getting energy into them, there's industries and mines within the state, so the potential is there. The state's made moves with the signing of the bill last year. It's just, the snowball started down the hill, I would say, and it's just going to come to fruition over time. It just takes time to build the momentum behind a nuclear opportunity here. So,
Excellent. So the next three questions I think work together pretty well. So the question here is, America still remembers 3 Mile Island. Help us understand how this can't happen with a microreactor. In fact, there are 3 large nuclear accidents in the world: 3 Mile Island, Chernobyl, and Fukushima. And people understand those and have some fears about them. But then I made a statement earlier: nuclear industry is one of the safest in the world. So help us reconcile those 2 sets of information.
Sure. So, Mark covered some of this. I mean, the fuel design is much different. So, from a safety perspective, the fuel is really a large step change in the way it functions from a safety perspective. The large nuclear plants that you mentioned, right? There's those plants are 150 to 250 times the size of the microreactors we're talking about. So the pure amount of energy potential in them is much greater. And those also are more complex designs than ours. Really, requiring a pumped water system, as those plants, did and do. There are more challenges with that. But I'll say again, as Mark mentioned, the safety record of nuclear, even though those are somewhat the things that are in our minds often when we think of nuclear, is actually the most safest power generation system from a fatalities per megawatt produced by a very wide margin. 3 Mile Island, while it was the largest accident in the U.S., really pales in comparison and cannot even really be compared to Fukushima, let alone Chernobyl. So from an impact perspective, there really was little to none to that community. So I think it's easy to get tied up into there's some of these big accident scenarios that have happened, but these designs are much different. And I'll also point out, even our large nuclear fleet in the United States, France, throughout the world has been operating impeccably safely now for decades. Mm-hmm. So I think we also just have to look at that from a factual basis. I really encourage that, because it's, these little single points are anyone can pick little data points and try to throw them out there, but you really got to look at the details here. Nuclear is the safest power generation, invention there's been, since the last 60, 70 years.
And I'll add to that, nobody died from the radiation from 3 Mile Island or Fukushima. Chernobyl's a different story. That's Russian technology, Russian operations, and we can go into great length of detail about why American technology is much safer and more secure than Russian, but suffice it to say, those are the data points. Let me move to the second part of this three-part question, and that is security. We talk a lot about the safety already, but if one of these microreactors were deployed in a rural setting, what does security look like? How can we be assured that nobody's going to attack that plant or steal some of the fuel?
So I think in terms of what does it look like, it should be relatively minimal. And from a security point of view, we keep coming back to the fuel and the properties the fuel brings. And once again, fuel plays a really strong hand in this argument. So by creating a fuel that's in these tiny particles with very strong, very tough coatings around them, all consolidated in a monolithic block, you create something that really is quite unattractive in terms of taking that and trying to do something else with it, reprocess it. We talked about the challenges of reprocessing, and that's probably something that will come in the future, but isn't technology yet. It's probably easier to go and get your own uranium and enrich it from scratch than it is to try and do anything you shouldn't be doing with fuel from one of these reactors.
All right, thanks. Yeah, that gets to to the third part, which is nuclear could be for everyone, but the risks are understood by only a few. We talked about the record, which we think is very good. So what do we need to do to help the public better understand the safety record and the performance of nuclear energy and help them become more familiar or comfortable with our technology?
I think you've heard some of that from the panel here today, and I think it's to have engagement such as this, to have detailed conversations, to front up, if you like, and talk about nuclear, enjoy talking about nuclear, and talk about the positives of it, talk about the facts, talk about the data, and help people understand that really this is an industry that's very, very responsible, really understands the weight of what it takes on, and puts all the right systems and processes in place to make sure safety is our number one priority. So I think you engage, you talk, you help understanding, and it's not only understanding of the technology, but that burden of responsibility that we all feel when we put products into the field.
Yeah, I could completely agree. I mean, for Westinghouse, for instance, or any of us to put something out into the field that we don't believe in, it could be the end of our company, right? So there's no incentive for any of us to do something that's even remotely risky from a safety perspective. It's just completely against what all of our companies would ever want to do, and even the benefit of our companies, right? So, but I do agree. I think the governor said it at the beginning, right? It's the dialogue. It's also just getting away from kind of the sensationalist type of things and the political views one way or another on these types of technologies. It's just like anyone else who's spoken up here. It's you ask the questions. Feel free even to challenge us. I don't think we're afraid to answer these questions because we believe we have a great story to tell and we like to tell it. So engage with us. We'll do the same. We'll engage with you all and the communities as well.
Yeah, absolutely. With that, I'd like to thank the speakers here today and welcome anyone to come talk with us.